Hello and welcome to the Mosquito Minute, brought to you in partnership with the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute. I'm Rushka Suben, Africa correspondent at the Naked Scientists, reporting from the front lines of malaria research, mosquito control, and the fight to save lives across the continent. Malaria has been killing humans for at least 15,000 years, and our DNA still carries the scars. 90% of the world's malaria cases are in Africa. But this isn't just a modern health crisis. It's written into our evolutionary history. New research from the University of Cambridge reveals that early humans actively avoided malaria hotspots across Africa for tens of thousands of years. The archaeological record is striking. Mosquitoes thrived where people didn't live. Until something changed. Around 15,000 years ago, a genetic mutation emerged in West Africa, the sickle cell trait. One copy protects powerfully against malaria, 2 copies can be fatal. And yet it was selected for so strongly that it unlocked entire regions of the continent previously off-limits to human settlement. Malaria didn't just kill people. It shaped where we went, how we lived, and who we became. I'm Rushka Suben in Johannesburg. Now Chris Smith speaks with Andrea Manica, an evolutionary ecologist at the University of Cambridge, about what ancient ancestors can teach us about grappling with malaria.
We've known for a long time diseases have been really important for our species. During medieval time, plague wiped out almost 2/3 of Europe. We know that malaria is still a major killer in Africa. We've seen the pandemic recently with COVID and how much that can suddenly change our society. What we've never really been sure about, though, is how important were diseases before people invented food production and therefore stopped in a place in large numbers. So most of our sort of ancient history is actually one of hunter-gatherers, small bands moving around the environment in rather small numbers. And so it's unclear at that point whether diseases can really impose a big pressure on such small groups or whether other problems like starvation would have been really the drivers of selection.
How can you get at that then, given it was so long ago? We're talking, 60, 70 plus thousand years ago?
It is indeed a long time ago, and so the problem is that we don't have direct evidence for it. So what we did was actually to take a slightly roundabout route. So we looked at where the vectors of malaria, the mosquitoes that carry malaria in Africa are at the moment. And there are about a dozen species which are really important. And what we did was to basically look at each of these species, determine what kind of environmental conditions, what kind of temperatures, how much precipitation you need, what kind of vegetation you need, and effectively define what ecologists call the niche where these particular species live right now. And then we use paleoclimate models to actually reconstruct where each of them would have been back in the past. And once we had a map of each of these species and how they moved around the continent, we could actually combine them together using some models that epidemiologists have built to actually predict how important is malaria now and how important might be malaria in the future. But in this case, we use those models to actually go back in the past to be able to say where malaria might have been.
So you end up with a historical map of malaria, effectively. You would have been able to point to a map of Africa and say this bit, this bit, this bit, these were malaria hotspots back in the past.
So what we could say was if malaria was there, would have been a really big problem. So in a way, we could actually say the areas where malaria could have been really prevalent. And that actually was the key finding of our studies when we actually then worked together with some archaeologists and put together all the archaeological information we have about our persistence in Africa back for the last 70,000 years. What we found was that all those hotspots were places where people were not. What we don't know is whether people were avoiding those places or whether they were just going there and dying very quickly.
Yeah, indeed, because it could be that's a swamp that mosquitoes love, and hence it would be a potential site for malaria to thrive, but people are not going to go there. Or were the people eschewing the area because there was the pressure of disease? Malaria was driving them away or killing them off.
Yeah, we do have some interesting hints from the archaeological record. There was this practice of using ochre as potentially an insect repellent. So probably people were bothered by insects and they were definitely aware. But what we don't know is in those areas which were particularly difficult because of malaria, whether people were really avoiding them actively or whether they were kind of going to their death on a regular basis. What we know, though, is that about 15,000 years ago, all of a sudden in West Africa, we start seeing people pushing into those areas that before were really, really not used. And what we also know from other studies is that about the same time in the area, we have the emergence of sickle cell anemia. Now, this is a mutation in our genome which can actually give us protection against malaria. Having said that, the problem of that mutation is if we have two copies, so if we receive one copy from mom and one copy from dad, we're dead. So in a way, to have such a problematic, in a way, solution to the problem being selected for, it means that malaria must have been a really important major driver. And indeed, we know now that the selection coefficient, so the strength of selection for this particular gene, is one of the highest in humans.
This argues then that a fairly dramatic change happens. We evolve the sickle cell trait about 15,000 years ago, and this unlocks access to these areas that previously were off limits for whatever reason. People are driven away by malaria. What effect does your data suggest that would have had on our early ancestors?
What we see at that particular point is definitely that there is this increase in connectivity throughout Africa. And there are arguments that potentially that is the precursors of eventually building up enough innovation that would have allowed you to have food production and would have actually allowed you to get some of the big changes that we see demographically in Africa that lead to these eventually sedentary groups that stick to one place and actually change the environment as much as we're changing it now. And indeed, in these periods is when we start seeing the start of more fires, more changes of forests being transformed into something. Is not the full production, the agriculture that we kind of think about normally, but it's the very first steps of people changing their relationship with the environment, in a way shaping it more and more.
There are other diseases that people have pointed a finger at and said, we can find evidence that there are genetic changes in humans that seem to protect against those and may come at a cost to the humans. Cystic fibrosis, the gene, is incredibly common in the human population, and some argue it gives us defense against certain bacterial infections like typhoid. So do you think that your analysis, you've found this really interesting relationship between sickle cell trait and protection against malaria? Could we see a similar effect with these other genetic changes?
It's quite possible. Some of them obviously will be more recent events like the plague, and we know that there are, for example, a couple of mutations in a couple of current diseases, autoimmune diseases that might have well been favored during the plague, giving a bit better response to that disease. What we're starting now, in a way, is a bit of a bigger project to try and think about how many diseases can we track back in the past, like we have done for malaria, and see, in a way, how many of the stories that we have, though quite often very quickly attributed to more historical times, might actually have some deeper roots. Some will just be historical, but my bet would definitely be that some of them have an older story to be told.
My thanks to Andrea Manica and Chris Smith. The Mosquito Minute, brought to you in partnership with Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute. You can now follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn. Music in the program is sponsored by Epidemic Sound. Perfect music for audio and video productions.